Hello from New York, I'm Chris Hayes. Rescue workers in Turkey are trying to reach people trapped under wreckage after a deadly earthquake struck near the city of Van, not far from the Iranian border. Police in Chicago and Sydney, Australia arrested dozens of Occupy Wall Street protesters early this morning. And in Libya, Reuters reports that an autopsy of Muammar Gaddafi determined that he died of a gunshot wound. Rebel leaders are expected to announce Libya's liberation officially today, the same day Tunisia holds elections, the first of the Arab Spring. We had an amazing discussion yesterday on Libya, Iraq, and America's role in the Middle East. Today, we're focusing on the problems President Obama faces here at home. Joining me are Daily Caller columnist James Polis, whose work has also appeared in The American Conservative, The American Spectator, and who founded the blog The Postmodern Conservative, which is a great name for a blog and an ideology. Mary Kay Henry, the president of the Service Employees International Union, SEIU, representing more than 2 million workers in various service fields. Mary Kay, we had to have you here because everybody has union presidents on their Sunday shows, so we needed to get in line. And Dahlia Litwick, senior editor and legal correspondent for Slate.com, and truly one of the finest prose stylists anywhere on the internet. It's great to have you all here. So President Obama's battle with the GOP over jobs is far from over. Senate Republicans last week blocked a vote on a $35 billion plan to help states hire and keep teachers, cops, and firefighters, saving an estimated 400,000 jobs. Now Democrats are pushing a $50 billion plan that would create and save jobs by spending to improve our nation's roads and bridges, while Republicans are pushing what they call a jobs plan that would cut spending in order to fund another tax break for job creators, who are more popularly known as rich people and already have the money to create new jobs if they wanted. In his weekly address yesterday, President Obama marked the end of the Iraq War and the death of Muammar Gaddafi by calling for using the peace dividend to fund his jobs bill.
As we end these wars, we're focusing on our greatest challenge as a nation, rebuilding our economy and renewing our strength at home. Over the past decade, we spent $1 trillion on war, borrowed heavily from overseas, and invested too little in the greatest source of our national strength, our own people. Now the nation we need to build is our own. We have to tackle this challenge with the same urgency and the same unity that our troops brought to their fight. That's why we have to do everything in our power to get our economy moving again. That's why I'm calling on Congress to pass the American Jobs Act.
So, James, I want to get your take on this because it seems to me that you can have a lot of disagreements with a whole lot of what the president does as a conservative, and I understand that. You don't like the Affordable Care Act or the Wall Street bill. On the narrow question of, in the midst of a recession, spending money from the federal treasury to being borrowed at 0%, right, because we have historically low interest rates, to prevent layoffs at the state level seems to me like the lowest hanging possible fruit. It doesn't even really seem that ideologically contested to me to say, in the midst of this recession, let's not continue to cut jobs. We're not doing a very good job of growing jobs, but let's not continue to cut jobs. Why? What is the objection? Explain to me the source of the objection to that.
Well, I think I'd respond at two levels. The first is just like the way this argument is framed, which I think is not helping the president. This strange sort of, we're so bad at nation building that we should do it at home.
You're talking about that clip.
Right.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure about it.
I don't think that's a great way to sort of cut into this problem. But at the level of sort of particulars, and I think this is causing problems for the president as well. When you have a guy like Ron Paul going on TV at the Republican debate and saying, look, if you have to just sort of empty the Treasury and sort of give money away, put it in the pockets of Americans, right? Don't use it to bail out the banks and to then turn around to the protesters and say, oh, well, the banks are sort of bad guys, but then I'm going to raise money from them. Obama's kind of stuck in this cognitive dissonance point, which I think doesn't allow him to make these kind of claims in a way that has a lot of credibility.
I think there's a grain of truth to that broadly. But to follow up on that, on the narrow question of this bill, which they pared down, they did it in the bite-sized pieces. You know, you can't swallow the whole thing. Here's a little bite-sized piece of it. It's remarkable to me that this is not something that Republicans want to do. I mean, it just seems like teachers, cops, firefighters, we could fire them now, and we could send a lot of people onto unemployment and COBRA and all sorts of other things that drain the state's coffers anyway. Or we can keep them fighting fires, policing people, and teaching kids at the cost of $35 billion, which is not peanuts, but in the grand scheme of things kind of is peanuts.
Well, obviously no one wants to be against firefighters, but that's kind of part of the problem.
You are, James.
Where do these huge pensions come from? Why do we have this sort of public pensions situation that we're in? I might construe it as a bigger problem than you might construe it as, but the fact is it's expensive. And when you're sort of looking at the way this jobs bill is being packaged, the way it's being presented, it's no surprise, I think, that you've got even a few Democrats like Montana Senator Jon Tester saying, this is really a stimulus bill. This isn't really a jobs bill, and I'm not going to be able to support this even as a Democrat unless we go about this in a different way.
I should note in that vote, the 50-50 vote that happened this week, that there were two Democratic defections, Mark Pryor and Ben Nelson from Nebraska, and also independent Senator Joe Lieberman. Mary Kay, you represent some public sector workers. You've both private sector and public sector.
Right.
When your members are talking to their Republican representatives, what are they hearing? I mean, what is the argument that you hear when you? I don't know how many Republican lawmakers you get to talk to, but what is standing in the way of sort of getting this pushed through?
Well, our members visited 100 Republican lawmakers through August, and what they heard was what you just said, which is that somehow tax cuts are supposed to magically create jobs. And if that was true, we'd have a full employment economy. So I just think it's absurd that we're having this debate over the $50 billion, as you just said, because there's an emergency in this country. And I believe if we put our heads to it, 15 million people could get back to work in January if, as a nation, our government, the private sector, and working people join together to get us back to work.
The Republicans have sort of engineered a lot of different ways of obstructing. Dahlia, you focus on legal issues, and in that realm, they've been remarkably virtuosic in defeating the president's initiatives, right? I mean, this is something that they've gotten very good at. Am I right?
Indeed, you are, Chris. I think we've got, certainly in I think the framework of the confirmation problem, just judicial confirmations, we've seen a one-way ratchet, which is to say I don't think anyone can say that this Republican Senate by any means started it. This has been going on, for decades now, that we block each other's judges. But it is unprecedented what we're seeing now, not only in terms of the number of judicial vacancies. We've got 32 judicial seats that are now deemed emergencies, judicial emergencies, so that the court cannot do its business because it's these empty seats. But what's really been interesting in this go-round is not only obstructing every judge, even if they're both home state senators endorse them, the ABA gives them the highest ranking, they still get blocked. They get slow walked for months and months. They wait and wait and wait. Great people like Goodwin Liu for the Ninth Circuit eventually withdraw their names. It's not just happening at the appeals courts anymore. Now it's happening at the district courts, at the lowest federal courts. And so the obstruction is sort of growing, spreading.
And this is the problem, right? I mean, you begin to feel, and I had this conversation with Melissa Perry the other night when she was sitting in for Rachel, where what you end up with is a situation in which the normal mechanisms of governments begin to look like they're totally broken and dysfunctional. Even routine things like confirming district court nominees, which did not used to precipitate these massive battles. And then that's in the domestic sphere. And then when you have in the foreign policy sphere is this sort of sphere of total unfettered power, where the president looks extremely effective because he can sit in the sort of imperial presidency and decree things, and they happen. And I think it causes a really perverse, seductive vision of sort of anti-democratic feeling in people when they look at the legislative body, which is Congress, which is the least approved and trusted institution in American life, and when they look at the president sitting in the sort of his seat of power as the foreign policy leader, they see this remarkable contrast in efficacy, right?
Well, it's interesting. I think there's a bit of a paradox here. It makes sense, sort of, when you look at it at first blush, that in Washington, this is where power is being diffused. People are trying to bring it together to accomplish things that it seems not to be working. There's all kinds of slippage, and when bipartisan things do happen, they tend not to really satisfy anyone. Whereas in foreign policy, this is where the president can sort of wade into things with his vorpal sword and sort of slay dragons or whatever.
I don't know that adjective, by the way. Vorpal?
Yes, this is reaching back to Dungeons and Dragons.
Okay, we got 809 is the first D&D reference on Up with Crusades.
My 12-sided die. But the paradox is this. I think actually the reason why D.C. and life inside the Beltway seems so dysfunctional is actually because it's concentrating so much power. The message that both parties are saying to the American people is, look, if you're not playing the game here in D.C., you're not going to be effective. You're not going to have any control over your lives. And I think that's tremendously damaging. Whereas in foreign policy, this is somewhere where power can actually be diffused, where the president can say, well, I'm going to send a handful of drones over there, or I'm going to drop 100 guys into this jungle over here. It's a place where power can sort of spread out.
That is a counterintuitive theory.
Yeah,
I'm not sure I agree with that.
It spreads outward, and it works that way.
Mary Kay, you'd also
there's
don't
also this problem at the state level. The attacks are happening. There's dysfunction in D.C. and there's dysfunction at the state level.
And it's not like the job situation is better at the state level.
No, not at all. And there's attacks happening on workers in Ohio and immigrants in Alabama and women in Mississippi. So it's way beyond Washington and foreign policy. To your point, obstruction is being joined with attack to divide people against each other and distract us from the notion, I believe, that we can get back to work.
And isn't it, Chris, also utterly self-fulfilling? It's the snake eating its own tail. If you're arguing that government doesn't work and it's broken, and then you're systemically breaking it by really making sure that entire branches of government can't function, then you're sort of self-fulfilling. You're creating something that, of course, the public doesn't trust the government because you're breaking it, this nihilistic notion the government's broken.
I want to get to this argument. I want to talk more about this because I want to talk about the sort of two theories of obstruction. A good faith theory, which is that Republicans think passing these things will be bad for the country and they don't believe them, and the bad faith theory, which is that they do not want to see the economy improve because they would like to see Barack Obama not reelected. So I want to talk about all that, and I want to bring to the table Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut, who's going to join us after this break. I'm not sure what happened in the last week, but after a Republican primary focused largely on undocumented workers, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and the human papillomavirus, the GOP field has seemed to discover the jobs crisis. Everyone is jostling now to tout their jobs plans. We don't really have to expend much mental energy to imagine what the world will look like under the GOP jobs plan because we are living in it. Remember, the case Republicans made back when they took over the House. They claimed the faltering economy was a byproduct, first and foremost, of our projected future federal deficits. The idea was that the CBO projections, federal deficits for a few decades from now, had so paralyzed our heroic job creators, they couldn't bring themselves to create jobs amidst the crushing atmosphere of uncertainty. Liberals said this was preposterous. The economy's problem wasn't deficits, it was lack of demand. Consumers had too much debt and not enough money. People needed jobs. And once folks had jobs and households had money to spend, businesses would invest and start hiring. But since January this year, we've been living in the Republicans' world of spending cuts and deficit obsession. We cut spending to avoid a government shutdown, and then cut spending again to avoid a U.S. government default. The super committee is now working hard to come up with more cuts, and if they can't come to an agreement, then the trigger will guarantee more spending cuts yet. Remember when John Boehner said this?
I got 98% of what I wanted. I'm pretty happy.
Well, he was right. And this is what his world looks like. Since January, we've lost 241,000 public sector jobs. Last quarter's GDP growth was a paltry 1.3%. Overall unemployment remains stuck at 9.1%. So that's where we are, not waiting to see what would happen to the economy if Republicans got 98% of what they wanted, but living in it. Right now, I'm pleased to welcome Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut into the studio here on Up. Senator, cannot thank you enough for making the trip down here.
It's great to be with you.
Great to have you here. The jobs bill went down to defeat a Republican filibuster this week. Where do you see things going from here? I mean, the opposition seems implacable to any kind of jobs plan, even one that seemed relatively non-controversial. So what now? What do you do?
The opposition really is incomprehensibly implacable because many of these proposals have been endorsed before by Republican members of Congress, the Republican Party, even leaders of the Republican Party. So I'm still hopeful that where we go from here is some kind of agreement, at least on some of the pieces of the president's proposal, and to take one of them that would seem to be incontrovertibly desirable, putting teachers and first responders back to work. Seems like it makes eminent good sense.
Well, sure it does, but they all voted against it in a party line vote.
And I'm still hopeful that we can bring back that proposal because some of the objection may have been to the way of paying for it.
I see.
And that way of paying for it involved a tax, and of course Republicans are against any tax, even if it's on people earning $1 million or more. But I still hope that common sense will prevail, and we can bring people together. You know, Chris, as I go around the state of Connecticut, and I hear my colleagues saying the same thing all around the country, people want us to come together. They want us to get something done. They are frustrated and angry and appalled. And I've been in the United States Senate for a grand total of about 10 months now, and I can tell you I'm angry and appalled at the level of partisanship and division and acrimony that right now is literally crippling our democratic process.
Were you surprised, to stay on this vote for a second, the 50-50 vote, there were three defections in the caucus: Mark Pryor from Arkansas, Ben Nelson from Nebraska, and a man you know very well, Joseph Lieberman, your fellow senator from Connecticut, who is an independent but caucuses with the Democrats. If it is the case that this is such an incontrovertibly desirable piece of legislation, why did your colleague, were you surprised that your colleague voted against it?
I'm surprised that anyone voted against it.
Smoothly done, Senator.
I think that they face difficult situations at home, perhaps criticisms of these proposals in difficult races. But I think, again, coming back to what we need to do on the path forward, as you've just depicted in the very enlightening and entertaining little stand-up that you did, consumer
I told
demand.
You to say that off during break, just so everyone's clear on that. Keep going. Consumer demand.
Consumer demand is absolutely critical.
Yeah.
And the best way to create consumer demand and promote it and foster it around the country is to put people back to work. And that's what we need to do as soon as possible. The Republicans have a point, which is that uncertainty and lack of demand is a fundamental weakness right now in our economy. And the best way to create more demand is to put people back to work. Now, here's another reality.
Please.
On the ground. As I go around Connecticut, there are a lot of manufacturers, a lot of employers who have jobs. They have openings right now. They can't find people with the skills to fill them. And job training, and I'd go even farther than the president has on this point, is absolutely essential right now. On-the-job training, pathways back to work, has to involve giving people the skills to fill the jobs that exist right now.
And you actually have a piece of legislation, right, that you've introduced about pathways to work. What exactly would that do? How would you operationalize that?
First of all, providing the means for employers to provide internships and apprenticeships so that people can learn on the job. Nothing like job-based skill training. So that we have, for example, welders in training in our community colleges. We have advanced technology manufacturing. People want to work in aerospace parts manufacturers. Machine tooling has changed so that now computers are involved. That proposal would involve support. It would involve also the kind of subsidies for the actual jobs that need to be created.
You just mentioned something that some employers have been talking about, and some Republicans talk about this a lot, which is essentially a skills mismatch, right? So there's two problems in the economy. There's a problem that there's a lack of demand, right? There's the people, we have high unemployment. There's not a lot of personal disposable income. But there's also, you will hear largely from Republicans, but from some Democrats, and I've heard from the president himself, that there's a skills mismatch problem. And people call this the structural unemployment argument. And I guess I want to hear, and I've been asking every sort of politician we spoke to, what is your understanding of the present crisis? When you look at what has happened and why we have this persistent 9% unemployment, what is the story you tell yourself? How do you come to understand what the problem is?
There are thousands of jobs unfilled because people don't have the skills, either because they can't move, they can't sell their homes. There is a foreclosure and a housing crisis that impedes people having the mobility to fill those jobs. Second, right now in manufacturing, a lot of these jobs involve computers, they involve skills that people don't have, and our community colleges, our vocational technical educational institutions can help people fill. We need to provide the kind of support for those institutions, not necessarily four-year college degree. Mm-hmm. And our elementary and secondary education, which we just marked up in the Health Education Labor Committee, promotes not only college readiness but also career readiness.
Let's talk for a second about the pay for, the side of the ledger in the bill that just went down to defeat. that was a 0.5% surcharge tax on millionaires. That was right. That was the legislation. Now, you represent the great state of Connecticut. I have been to Connecticut. I have been to Greenwich and Danbury. It's very lovely.
Welcome back.
It's a very lovely state with these very lovely places with very lovely homes. And there are a lot of people in the great state of Connecticut who run hedge funds, who work in finance, and would be hit by this tax. And I wonder if you could be as honest and frank as possible. You have to raise money from these people. You go and you see them, you hang out with them, you talk to them. What do you hear from them? Is there a lot of resistance to that? Is that something that you basically have to say, look, this is the right thing to do? Or are people willing to kind of see their taxes go up? I'm very curious.
Well, first of all, Chris, people want America to succeed. You know, believe it or not, people earning $1 million or more are also very patriotic, and their attitude is, I'm willing to pay as long as I'm assured that this money will be well used. And a lot of them feel, and this point is true about the interest carried forward issue as well, that this country's been very good to them, and they want to be treated fairly. And they want to make sure that the money is used well, and that we take measures to rein in government spending, to restrain the debt and the deficit, which is an essential part of what we have to do. And fiscal responsibility and prudence are very much part of our platform. The Democrats do not want to just spend. We also want to make smart cuts, underscore smart cuts, and that has to be part of the agenda. So people in that position, and remember, we're talking about people earning more than $1 million, not just people who have more than $1 million. Right. People earning
income,
more than $1 million.
Wealth, yes.
Income, not wealth. And it's 0.05%, which is pretty small when you consider what the impact could be on them personally in reviving the economy, promoting economic growth, which in the long run is good for those hedge funds and investors and everyone else.
But it's way beyond individual millionaires. There's corporations that haven't paid a dime in tax, and we need everybody to pay their fair share.
I want to talk about fair share taxation. We're going to keep the senator here, if that's all right. Senator Blumenthal from Connecticut. We're going to talk more about that right after this break. All right. Fantastic little pixies here Sunday morning. Special choice of Senator Richard Blumenthal. I'm kidding, that was my choice. At a time when 1 in 6 people are living in poverty, in the midst of massive unemployment crisis, when not enough jobs are being created, the talk for almost 2 years have been about debt and austerity and the tightening of America's proverbial belt. A great cover story in The Nation this week, my favorite magazine. My colleague Ari Berman describes how what he calls the austerity class was able to shape the economic dialogue in D.C. You don't believe me? Take a look at this graph. It's a great graph. In the last week of July, thinkprogress.org looked at cable news coverage, found that between Fox News, CNN, and our own MSNBC, the word unemployed was mentioned just 75 times. The word unemployment was mentioned 427 times, while the word debt was mentioned more than 7,000 times. Now things have changed. On the one hand, it's because of Occupy Wall Street and its fifth week. It's grown from a group of people who are supposed to lack a concentrated message without any economic expertise to a full-fledged movement. In large part, has pushed talk of the U.S. economy to the top of national news coverage. On the other hand, it has to do with the president, who is pushing his jobs plan, has given over 20 speeches. So take a look at a more recent graph. thinkprogress.org went back to these 3 cable networks last week and discovered the word debt was mentioned 398 times, the word unemployment 506 times, the word Occupy and Wall Street 1,200 and 2,387 times respectively, while the word jobs was mentioned more than 2,700 times. Almost a complete reversal of the narrative. Do you feel, Senator, like the conversation has turned?
I think it has turned finally, probably well overdue, that it should have turned. You know, I've been talking about jobs. In fact, I introduced a bill, and it was largely what we call a message bill, that would have established a select joint committee on job creation.
So just so people are aware, the Select Joint Committee is the technical name of the super committee, which is now charged with finding talks. So it would be a super committee for jobs.
It would be a super committee for jobs, and it would do the same thing that the Select Committee on Debt or Deficit is supposed to do, which is report by deadline and seek full employment, which these days probably is about 5%, 6%, but at least put jobs first on the agenda. This was well before Occupy Wall Street, because I believe very strongly the best way to solve the debt and the deficit situation, or one essential means of doing it, and one part of what we have to do, is to put America and put Connecticut back to work, because that's the way that we will eventually, and it happened during the Clinton administration, which was the last time that we had a surplus, remember. Yeah. The best way is to put people back to work.
But Mary Kay Henry of SEIU, haven't Democrats been largely been part and parcel of the problem in terms of the conversation on austerity? I mean, the president himself talks about tightening the belt, that families have to tighten the belt the way the government has to tighten their belt. Democrats have been talking about debt and deficit and austerity and cuts. Nancy Pelosi, probably the most powerful progressive politician in America at a certain level, said we have entered an age of austerity. I mean, so haven't Democrats been have a large share of the blame in this as well?
Well, if you look at what Democrats have been saying in the past 60 days, it has been about jobs. And I think if the senator was to think about this select committee as declaring a state of national emergency and having our country respond as if it's a state of emergency like we did for the hurricane, 9/11, I just think we should be thinking not about the 300,000 public service jobs you talked about at the beginning of the show, but 15 million people. We have the resources in this country to get 15 million people back to work and restore American manufacturing, get back to innovation. Amazon tried to build the LCD screen in this country, looked for a year. There was no technology in any plant that allowed them to stay here and make it. There are people all across this country that love American innovation and genius, and we want to make it in our country.
But I would like you to respond to what Senator Blumenthal said before about this question of the skills mismatch, because this may sound a little in the weeds, but it's actually a very important contested ideological point, because there's two ways of looking what's happened in this recession. One is that we had this huge crisis, right, the financial crisis, and we have tons of debt that we're deleveraging, and people are out of work basically because we had this cataclysm. And the other, which I've heard from Democrats, is that basically the economy during the boom years was actually really, there was a skills mismatch, and it was covered up by the fact that we had this housing boom, and now the housing boom going away is like the tide lowering and showing what's left on the beach. There are different ways to respond to each of those. And when you hear Democratic Senator talk about the skills mismatch, do you think that's the right way to think about it?
Well, I think there's like 1 million skills mismatch jobs, but there are 14 million jobs that workers are ready to go and do. Roads and bridges, fix the schools. 3.8 million home care workers can provide care and health care. There's broadband. There's plenty of things that we can figure out how to match community college retraining, as the senator said, to upskill people. But there's lots of work that needs doing right now that people are ready to go make happen. I think the skills mismatch thing is a smokescreen myself.
Well, we have jobs and we have a need for investment. And part of the president's program and part of what has been proposed again and again and again is building roads, bridges, schools, ports. Yeah. So that we avoid some of the environmental impacts of the way we transport things in the country now. We need to make things in America. We need to rebuild. That's a challenge for job creation. And the construction industry right now is very much underutilized, unemployed. So I agree there are jobs right now for which people have the skills, but we need to make sure that we invest and create those jobs.
Senator Richard Blumenthal from Connecticut, who's going to stay with us, and we'll talk more about jobs right after this break.
What's going on is that Democrats are obsessed, for some reason, with raising taxes. That's the only possible way to explain their latest idea to impose a permanent tax hike on about 300 U.S. business owners, and then use the money to bail out cities and states that can't pay their bills. That's the proposal we'll be voting on, apparently, tomorrow.
using the money. That's Mitch McConnell, of course, Senate Minority Leader from Kentucky, talking about the plan that went down to defeat this week as a bailout for the states that can't pay their bills, which I thought was a deft bit of messaging. James Poulos, you've been very patient sitting here listening to us liberals yabber on. What do you make of all this?
Well, you've set the table very nicely, so now I'll try to make my way through it. I think that perhaps the rhetoric is getting away from us a little bit here. I think there is something a little bizarre about saying, let's treat this jobs crisis as if it were an act of God or like an earthquake in Turkey, that's something that's happened to us, rather than saying, how are we sort of responsible for what's happened? What are the structural things that work here that's given us this situation? I think it's strange, with all due respect, to invoke the super committee as an example of something we should do more of, like based on sort of what the super committee is doing now and what its prospects are. The idea that, well, if this is sort of a model for how we can move forward legislatively, I'm not sure that makes a tremendous amount of sense. And when I hear McConnell in that clip that you just played, this to me is reminiscent of Paul Krugman's argument, which is, yes, the stimulus was too small. We need 2 or 3 times, perhaps more stimulus than what we got, because the stimulus that we had just basically went into state coffers and was sucked up by state debt. And so it just sort of took us back to square one rather than getting us out of the hole. I think that that's sort of a crazy argument, because if you actually go to the American people with a Krugman-sized stimulus, they'll say, well, wait a minute. If it's that large, if that's the size that we're talking about to actually move the needle at all, then that says some pretty horrifying things about where we are structurally as a country. So I guess I'd pose the question to you, Senator, is, we've talked a lot about sort of how the Republicans fall short in their criticism of the president's plan. But the whole reason why the president called a joint session of Congress, called them to the carpet and said, pass this bill, 800 times or whatever it was because all of his previous policies had basically not accomplished what they'd set out to accomplish. So if Democrats are so smart, as you like to say, about sort of making the right cuts and sort of fiscal responsibility, what do you make of this idea that the Krugmans of the world advance, that basically what the president has put forward is simply not enough, and in fact we need to be more irresponsible in terms of what's typically presented as fiscal responsibility to actually get the job done?
That's a good question.
Well, I think it is a good question, and Democrats don't operate monolithically. We have our differences. I actually criticized the first stimulus package because I felt that it was not sufficiently targeted and directed to creating the kinds of jobs on the ground that are needed. Construction jobs, rebuilding our roads and bridges, and too much of it going to places where it could not accomplish the task. As important as the size of investment in our future and building is how it is directed and spent. And that's why I've been very specific in what I've asked to be done. And by the way, I just want to introduce one other element here,
please,
which is not only the size of our unemployment problem, but the nature of it. We're talking about people, half of our unemployed people have been out of work for 6 months or more. We face a different kind of unemployment problem now. So I propose, for example, that we bar discrimination against unemployed people. It's a bill that I've introduced, which I think is very important. And I think also that
unbelievable at this time in this country that you have to introduce legislation like that.
Ads that say in effect, the unemployed need not apply.
Right.
But I think the question is very, very significant because it goes to how we use money, and the government needs to be smarter in the way that it
But I want to push more on this notion that what we're doing is fiddling at the margins. I mean, I think that seems to me like a really fair critique to say even the best estimates of the American Jobs Act, the full thing, the $435 billion thing, was going to add 0.6% to GDP, right? The bill that went down, we're talking about 400,000 public sector jobs, teachers, firefighters, but we have 15 million people unemployed.
That's right.
So I think there's a fair question of, are we really just kind of fiddling while Rome burns, even when we're doing these things at the margins that don't even begin to scale? And then and then on the other side, to go to James' point, which I think is a good one, is to do things at the scale we would need is completely politically untenable.
Well, to do things, to fiddle at the margins, apparently, is politically untenable. Right. And that's the answer to your question. We can't do these negligible things. So, I mean, I think I'm here to be a proud defender of fiddling at the margins. If that's what we can get, let's do it.
And I'm here to push it. I don't think that it is sufficient. And I support the senator trying to do it. But, James, here's the question. There's 1 in 6 people in this country living in poverty. And there's 1% of the country and corporations not paying a frickin' dime. And what are we doing as a country if we're going to, worry about how do we get into this mess as opposed to you and I figuring out how do we get out of it?
Right. Well, I mean, one way to respond to that is to say, and this goes to fiddling at the margins, is if when push comes to shove, the answer is, well, we can create more government jobs, which are sort of this artificial little area of the economy.
Let's create private sector jobs, brother. We'll take any kind of job. We just want to go back to work.
I think the question here is, can the government create private sector jobs? Can it create an employment relationship that wouldn't exist other than sort of the government sort of dropping a load of money on people and saying, here, we'll just sort of stimulate. I'm not sure if you can stimulate jobs, right? I'm not sure the government can actually create jobs. And I'm not sure, and this goes to the Republicans. Republicans are in the strange position of saying, well, yes, you can create jobs, but the way that you do it is basically by just cutting tax rates for these job creators. I'm not so sure that really washes either. It's entrepreneurs who create jobs.
You're in the camp. Right? You're in the camp of there's nothing we can do, and I want to talk more about that right after this break. Quick reset. Back at the table here in New York. Listen to a little Edward Sharp and I forget their name anyway. James Poulos, you were just making a very provocative point, and I think it's interesting because it doesn't align necessarily with either of the two major political parties right now. I think Democrats say we can hire people directly in public sector jobs and we can stimulate the economy. Republicans say cut taxes on job creators. And you're basically making the point neither of those can do anything. There's actually not a lot we can do. We just have to kind of suck it up and deal and muddle through. Mary Kay Henry, what do you think of that?
I talked to Siemens CEO. They created a wind turbine plant, employed 5,200 people in South Carolina by getting an agreement with the state government to change the railroad system, improve the community college retraining because they needed to train people up for these $75,000 a year jobs. I don't think it's either is the problem. I think it's it's not just public service jobs or let the market create jobs mysteriously through tax cuts and no regulation, because that hasn't happened in the past 10 years. And so we have to put government, private sector, working people together and make a decision that we can do big things as a country.
But here is the thing. When you start to talk about these kind of partnerships, I think there's a certain conservative critique we've seen developed, which is that our government is so corrupt that we cannot trust those partnerships. That essentially, when you start spending money through the Recovery Act, et cetera, you're going to get a lot of favor making. You're going to essentially get a lot of cronyism. You're going to get so-and-so raises a lot of money, and so your wind turbine factory gets money. People don't, whether that's true or not, I don't think it's largely true, but there is a perception that the game is so rigged, the system is so corrupt, the system in which you, Senator, are embedded is so corrupt that we can't be trusted to do that in a sort of fair way.
Well, here's the hard, stark reality. More than 70% of all new jobs in the United States of America are created by small businesses. Government doesn't create jobs. It removes the obstacles or it provides tools to the job creators. It removes obstacles like unfair trade practices from the Chinese or currency manipulation. It provides tools like tax credits to hire those long-term unemployed. Part of what I've proposed, part of the agenda has to be, for example, providing a $4,000 tax credit to people who hire people out of work for 6 months or more. We need to deal with this structural issue, but it needs to be, as Mary Kay Henry said, both private and public sector, and investment in the future. You know, we really have an obligation to provide better schools and roads and ports and bridges, because we're going to be falling behind the rest of the developed or undeveloped world.
Senator Richard Blumenthal from Connecticut, I'm going to keep you one more break if that's all right, right? Sure. And then you can get about your Saturday. We'll be right back after this.
Are you for that?
We were talking employee discrimination and collective bargaining and how to get jobs started. Before the break, I put Senator Blumenthal in the time machine and sent it back to Saturday. It is Sunday. My executive producer informs me the news desk is telling me it is Sunday. We're on this question of can we create jobs? How do we create jobs? And is there the political will to do it? And is the system that would create jobs, which is essentially some level of government spending, is it efficacious enough, trustworthy enough that we can trust it to actually do it? And I think one of the arguments, and Mary Kay, I'd like you to respond to this, we looked at the numbers as we were preparing the show, and you look at the Recovery Act, and one of the hardest things to do is make this counterfactual argument, right? There's all sorts of independent economic analyses that say the problems would have been much worse if not for the Recovery Act. Anywhere between 1 million and 2 million jobs, somewhere in there. It's very hard to sort of get that number nailed down.
Right.
But at the same time, the actual number is 9% unemployment, 15 million unemployed. How do you make the case that we need to do more in the vein of that Recovery Act when people look around and I think say, well, it didn't work. We're still in a bad situation?
Well, the people are making the case. Occupy Wall Street, talking about 99% and 1%, the terrible gross inequality that's happening, and the debate that's happening in the Congress, I think, is making the case, which is, again, we have the resources. We don't have the leadership or will that is willing to come together to get the resources on the table and invest in our people to get back to work. So I think it's listening to the people. When the senator started by saying, I'm hopeful about this kind of being able to get to yes at some point in the Senate, I'm hopeful because people are in the streets saying this way of life in America is unacceptable to us.
Do you think your colleagues feel that pressure? Do you think they are feeling pressure because people are in the streets, because we're now talking more about jobs?
I think that the pressure is building, not just because people are in the streets, but people at their kitchen tables, people in their town halls. The silent majority, as it was once known, are saying you have to get something done. And somebody said to me the other, I don't care what it is you do, you have to come together and do something to address the jobs issue. We did a jobs fair in Connecticut, and people said, what's a United States senator doing a jobs fair for? And we had 1,000 people to meet with 50 employers, and I don't need Occupy Wall Street to show me the hurt in their eyes, the needs that they feel, the fact they face foreclosure. My colleagues have to be facing the same thing.
Senator Richard Blumenthal from Connecticut, it is a great pleasure to have you at the table. I hope we can have you back. We'll get a chance to ask questions to one Republican presidential candidate, a candidate who supports Occupy Wall Street. That's coming up next.